Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 1. We talked a little bit about verse 1 Sunday. We got kind of in the middle of it, and so we'll just begin there again. But this is the third comparison that he's bringing on these covenants, and this one is where the two tabernacles are compared. And this consumes the first 12 verses of chapter 9. Verse 1 says, "Then verily the first covenant had also ordinances of divine service and a worldly sanctuary." So the writer now leaves the comparison of the two covenants, and he advances to the comparison here between the two tabernacles. And he uses the tabernacle in the wilderness, even though there were three other temples. There was the temple of David, the temple of Ezra, and then the temple of Herod that was being built during Jesus' ministry. But this tabernacle in the wilderness is the one he uses because this is the one that Moses built and that God showed him the pattern to go by. So keeping the context in mind here, that's what he's talking about, is this wilderness tabernacle. Now, there's not anything that the writer says that belittles anything about the law of Moses and worship under the law. He's not belittling the tabernacle or the service in the tabernacle or anything like that. He's just mentioning facts. And these facts are what he's going to use in his contrast with the tabernacle that's made without hands, the one that he wants to talk about. And so in comparing these, he's going to get these Hebrew Christians to realize that the one that they are contemplating leaving, and which they indeed will leave if they leave Christ to go back to the law, then they're going to be giving up something that's incomparably superior for something that God used for 1,500 years, but which was only a figure of what was to come. So he's really speaking of the tabernacle in the wilderness in a grand way, because it was a wonderful gift. It was a wonderful thing that the Jewish people had. There was no nation on earth that had anything comparable to it, because it was made after God's commands. He gave explicit instructions about how it's to be put together and the service performed in it. So it was really something great for the world to have. Now, since this first covenant was set up, organized, and dictated by God, we can see that God was pleased with it. He was pleased with it for the time being. It served the purpose during that time. But another characteristic of this tabernacle is that it was worldly, or it was earthly. This means that it occupied a physical place and a physical location on earth, and almost everything about it was specified to the nth degree. And even the material it was made from was specified. The size of its rooms were specified. The number of rooms, the contents of each room was very specifically commanded by God, and even the measurements of the furniture that was to go in those rooms was specified. In fact, if you want to read something kind of boring, read the instructions that God gave Moses on how to make this tabernacle, and it'll almost put you to sleep, because he tells the dimensions of the table, the heights of the table, the width and the length, and what it's made of, and it's overlaid with gold or what, and just everything about it, even how it's to be decorated. So Very, very specific. So none of this was to belittle what they had under the law. In fact, the writer here, speaking by inspiration of the Holy Spirit, brings all of these things out to show them that what they had was exactly what God wanted them to have. And that's a great thing. Then he comment on verse 1. All right, let's look at verse 2. For there was a tabernacle made, the first, wherein was the candlestick and the table and the shewbread, which is called the sanctuary. Now, the word tabernacle here translates the Greek word skene. And another translation of that word is tent. Skene is a tent, or it's a tabernacle. But we know that the tabernacle in the wilderness was a tent. And it was held up on poles. It had ropes to secure it, and it had sides that were put in. So it was a tent that they were able to take down and move and put up again, take down and move and put up again. And this is what they did for 40 years in the wilderness. Went around with this tent, and every time they moved in a different place, they had to take it down, transport it, reconstruct it, but it was made for this function. So when he says here the first, wherein was a candlestick, the first does not mean that there were two tabernacles. But it refers to the first room within the tent. Now, this was also known as the holy place, this first room was. But it had another room that was divided from the first room by a curtain. And this other room was known as the most holy place. And the reason for that name, most holy place, is because God's presence dwelt there in that second room. And the first room is the room closest to the entrance of the tent. There's a veil. You go through that first veil into the holy place. There's another veil. You go through that into the most holy place, those two rooms. Now the writer names three of the items here which were in the first room. One, he names the candlestick. Now the candlestick had a main shaft, and then from that main shaft were three sets of two branches. So that were 6 branches, and the main shaft made 7, and each one of those had a holder for a candle, so there were 7 places for candles to be inserted in the candlestick. And of course, its purpose was to give light in the holy place, because being a tent with the cover on it and the sides up and the curtains and all that, it was dark inside. And the priests had to see how to perform their duties, so they would come in of a morning and they would trim this candlestick. In other words, trim the candles, make sure that they burn brightly, trim the wicks and everything. We don't know much about that because we haven't had that much experience using candles for our light. But maybe in times of storms you burned them for a few hours and you got some experience with them. But they had to do this regularly, and so this was a function of this candlestick. Carl Ray?
I know a lot of Jewish people still today talk about a menorah. Is that what the Hebrew was for that lampstand, and they adapted that?
Yeah, I believe that's true. Yeah. I don't know for sure if that's the Hebrew word for candlestick, but that refers to the candlestick, and I think that's the Hebrew word for it, but I'm not positive. Now, the writer names 3 items that are in this room, and the candlestick is the first one. And for a complete description of it, you can look at Exodus 25 verses 31 through 40. And that gives us a complete description of that candlestick. Michael?
Did the candle, you said it had 7 holders, correct?
Yeah, 7 holders.
Did that have a meaning behind it, or was that just how it was? Was that?
If it does, I don't recall what it is. I think it was just, 7 is a very holy number in the scriptures, and it's used many, many times for different things. And 7 candlesticks is one of those uses. Okay. Now, the table that's mentioned here was needed for the shewbread. Now, the description of the table and its use is in Exodus 25, verses 23 through 30. Let me just read this one thing as an example of the detail of the descriptions that God gave. I'll read these verses 25 through 30 in Exodus 25. It says, "Thou shalt also make a table of shittim wood. The 2 cubits shall be the length thereof, and a cubit the breadth thereof, and a cubit and a half the height thereof. And thou shalt overlay it with pure gold, and make thereto a crown of gold round about. And thou shalt make unto it a border of an handbreadth round about, and thou shalt make a golden crown to the border thereof round about. And thou shalt make for it 4 rings of gold, and put the rings in the 4 corners that are on the 4 feet thereof. Over against the border shall the rings be for places of the staves to bear the table." Now, what they would do is when they moved the tabernacle, they would put those long poles called staves in the rings, and they would pick it up and rest them on the shoulders, and they would carry that like that. And of course, who had the job of doing this? What tribe?
Levi.
The tribe of Levi. They had the job of transporting, tearing down, transporting, erecting, re-erecting, and all the service of this. And it was specified very much so who did what. Now, those members of the tribe of Levi who handled the furniture in the most holy place, the Ark of the Covenant, and things like that, that was their job. And somebody else couldn't do it. Somebody else touched it, God'd kill them like that. You remember what happened to Uzzah when David was transporting the Ark of the Covenant? He had it on a cart, which was not the way to move it, because it had rings in it, and they were supposed to put poles in those rings and bear it on their shoulders. But David was transporting it on the ark, and then evidently one of the wheels of the ark went in a hole, and the ark was going to slide off, and Uzzah reached over there to grab it, and God killed him just like that for touching it. And it really upset David. And then God told him, he says, well, you should have moved it like God said move it. It's your fault, David. And he realized his sin for that. So, but this just gives us an idea of the degree to which God gave instructions for everything about this tabernacle. Now that's just one piece of furniture. All of it was this way. And if you read Exodus, there starting about chapter 20, where the law was given, on through about chapter, quite a few chapters there, you've got just chapter after chapter after chapter with these instructions. Now there were 12 loaves of shewbread that were to sit on this table, one to represent each tribe. It was made from unleavened fine flour, and to be eaten only by the priest. Now the bread was on display all week, and it was replaced with new loaves each Sabbath. So that bread lasted a whole week. Now, Ron was telling me the other day, they ate some bread somewhere in Europe, and after the first day, it's hard as a brick. I mean, it gets hard. You hit somebody in the head with it, it's like hitting him with a rock. And we used to buy bread every day in Romania because they don't put preservatives in that bread. But what they would do in Romania, which would kind of preserve the bread, they would bake these loaves out in the oven out in the yard, and they would bake enough for a whole week in the oven. But that bread was baked so hard, the outside of it had a crust on it about that thick. And what they would do is they would take that bread out, and they would take a pretty good stick, and they would beat that bread, and the crust would just fly off, and they would get it down to where it had a thin crust, and inside it was just as soft and good. Even if it's 3, 4, 5 days old, it was good and tastes fresh. But that crust kept it that way. And I thought I'd mention that to you just as an item of interest, because they kept this bread 7 days. And somebody may think, well, who'd want to eat 7-day-old bread? But they had a way of preserving it that we don't think of because we don't use things like that. Any comment? Okay, verse 3. And after the second veil, the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all. So the second veil designates the entrance through which the high priest must pass to gain entrance into the most holy place. And using this form of speech, the first veil would be the curtain flap from the outside to the inside of the holy place. The second veil from the holy place to the most holy place. And that veil didn't get used very much because who went in there? The high priest. How often? Once a year. Yeah, so that it didn't get used a lot. But this adjective is translated most here in this verse, in verse 3, or the holiest of all, is a superlative which indicates that this room is the holiest room in the tabernacle. And we'll learn why in the next 2 verses. Any comment on verse 3? All right, let's look at verse 4. Which had the golden censer and the ark of the covenant overlaid round about with gold, wherein was the golden pot that had manna and Aaron's rod that budded and the tables of the covenant. So this verse, especially in the King James, New International Version, and Tyndale's New Testament, all mistranslate here. The Greek word here, exosin, should be translated with our participial having, and but the King James says which had, past tense, and this creates a difficulty for the translators when they go on and they translate which had the golden censer. This most holy place did not have this golden censer in it. The golden censer was in the holy place, but the American Standard Version, New American Standard, English Standard, and Young's Literal Translation translate correctly here by saying having. Let me read you the American Standard Version, which says, or the English Standard Version, having the golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden urn holding the manna and Aaron's staff that budded and the tables of the covenant. The American Standard says, having a golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant overlaid, wherein was a golden pot holding the manna and Aaron's rod that budded and the tables of the covenant. So this word having here indicates that the use of this altar pertained more to God's presence in the most holy place, that rather than the service that was performed in the holy place by all the priests. Yet Aaron was to burn incense when he came into the holy place to dress and light the lamps. This was to be a perpetual incense before Jehovah, according to Exodus 30 and verse 8. In Exodus 30, verses 1 through 10, we're informed of the construction, placement, and use of this altar. Verse 6 says, "Thou shalt put it before the veil," talking about the second veil. We know this means it is put outside the most holy place, because verse 7 says, "Aaron shall burn thereon incense, sweet incense, every morning." Well, this had to be in the holy place, because Aaron could not enter into the most holy place but once a year. So there was no way he could burn sweet incense on this altar every morning if it was in the most holy place. So it was not in the most holy place, it was in the holy place. But since its use was to hide the presence of God, which was in the most holy place, the Hebrews writer here mentions it in connection with its purpose rather than its location. Its purpose was so that the incense could be burned to hide God's presence when Aaron went in with the blood. And so this explains the difficulty there, whereas the translators translated literally, but we must know the background to this in order to interpret it properly. And if we go to Exodus 30, the first 10 verses, read and study those verses in connection with this verse, then you'll understand how it should have been translated. Now, the second purpose of this golden offer of incense is described in Leviticus 16. Leviticus 16 is the chapter that deals with the Great Day of Atonement, which was an annual fast that Israel was to observe, because it was on that day that the sacrifices were offered to roll their sins forward once a year. So this altar then had a use on this day, because Aaron had to go into the most holy place in order to sprinkle the blood. Because where did he sprinkle it?
Across the mercy seat.
Yeah, on the mercy seat, which was where God dwelt. And he sprinkled it there. So he had to go in with this blood, and before he could do that, he'd have to burn this incense to hide God's presence from him, because if he accidentally saw God's presence, what would happen? He'd be killed. So you can imagine how carefully he observed this. He'd already lost 2 sons for doing something that they shouldn't have done, and he didn't want to lose his life too. And we kind of think, well, how could God do that? How could God be so cruel? It's not that God is cruel, it's that God is holy. He is so holy, he cannot allow sin in his presence. He cannot allow himself to be seen by sinful man. He can't allow that. But when Jesus Christ entered in, and he's going to bring this out, he entered into this most holy place with his own blood, opening the way for whom to approach God.
Amen.
All Christians. So, so this is what the writer is doing here. He's building up this old tabernacle service. He's building it up, exalting it, making sure they understand just how grand it was, what a wonderful thing they had, but he's going to show how much more wonderful what Christ has to offer than what they had. And yet they want to leave Christ and go back to that. I don't think so. They wouldn't if they knew what they were doing, and that's the purpose for him writing this. So, the instructions for making the Ark of the Covenant are found in Exodus 25, verses 10 through 15. This was called the Ark of the Covenant. Why? Why was it called the Ark of the Covenant?
Was kept within it.
Yeah, because the tables of stone, which the covenant was written on, were kept inside that box. It was really just a box. But it was a very specific box, made to very specific specifications, and its contents were specified as to what would be kept there. So very specific. So it had the Ark of the Covenant, the tables of stone called the covenant, from that it got its name, Ark of the Covenant. And it also had a pot of manna. And this is the only place in the Bible that we're told that this pot of manna, the pot that held the manna, was gold. The only place in the Bible that we're told that. So the Holy Spirit chose to wait until the Hebrews writer wrote Hebrews to reveal that aspect of that pot. And just think of that. God waited that long to reveal that. And it also had Aaron's rod that budded. And you remember the story of the significance of that rod? What was the significance of it? You remember?
There were several of them. They were trying to find out who the first priest was going to be, and they had each put their rod in for this, and the deal was is the one that budded would be the one that God chose.
Well, you're partially right.
Also, they kept snakes from biting them, kept them from dying if the snake bit them.
Yeah, but that was in connection with the brazen serpent.
That wasn't
No, that wasn't
rod.
this. This rod, you remember Korah's rebellion? Korah and Miriam came to Moses complaining. You think you're so important? God's the only one, you're the only one God spoke to? We're just as important as you are. And God come down and he called them out to the tent, and he says, he let them know. He says, Moses, I speak to face, and he let them know that they weren't just like Moses was. And he told them to cut these limbs from an almond tree, and he would demonstrate this. And Aaron's rod, who was Moses' brother, and of course the other Korah and Miriam were also just related like that too. But Aaron's rod put out buds and blooms. And the next morning they saw that God spoke this way, that Aaron was the one that God chose. What happened to Korah and them?
Korah and his family was swallowed up.
Yeah, the earth just opened up and closed back up on him. And can you imagine that? And so we see that that's the significance of this rod that budded, and it was kept in the ark. Now, later on in Solomon's time, which is about 500 years later, the only things in the ark were the two tables of stone. The pot of manna and the rod that budded were no longer in it. We don't know what happened to them, but that's just a factual statement, and we know that from 1 Kings 8 and verse 9. 1 Kings 8 and verse 9 says, there was nothing in the ark save the two tables of stone which Moses put there at Horeb when the Lord made a covenant with the children of Israel when they came out of the land of Egypt. Any comment on verse 4? All right, look at verse 5. And over it the cherubims of glory shadowing the mercy seat, of which we cannot now speak particularly. So the mercy seat and the two cherubims are described in Exodus 25:17 through 22. Now the mercy seat was made of pure gold, and it served as a lid for the ark. The cherubim were figures that had wings, and their faces were towards each other, their wings outspread, and their faces were down towards the mercy seat, and they were hooked on to the end of the ark. And so there was a cherubim on each end facing each other with its wings outstretched and face down facing the mercy seat where God's presence was. And Aaron sprinkled the mercy seat with blood on the Day of Atonement each year, both for his sins and for the sins of the people. That's in Leviticus 16, 14, and 15. Now, since the mercy seat was where God's presence dwelt, the blood was actually physically brought to his presence. The mercy seat had this particular name because it was there that God manifested his mercy towards man and his sins by forgiving their sins each year on the Day of Atonement. The word atonement is a very good translation because the sins were actually atoned for by the blood through God's grace. Leviticus 17:11 says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that maketh atonement for the soul." Now, atonement, I'm going to read you a little article here from the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament on the word atonement. It says, it means to atone by offering a substitute. The great majority of the usages concern the priestly ritual of sprinkling of the sacrificial blood, thus making an atonement for the worshiper. There are 49 instances of this usage in Leviticus alone, and no other meaning is there witnessed. The verb is always used in connection with the removal of sin or defilement, except for 3 passages in all the Old Testament. Those passages are Genesis 32:20, where it says, "You shall say, moreover, your servant Jacob is behind us, for he thought, I may appease him with the present that goes before me, and afterwards I shall see his face, perhaps he will accept me." The word appease there translates this verb. Another one is Proverbs 16:14, "A king's wrath is a messenger of death, and a wise man will appease it." Again, appease translates this verb. And the third instance is Isaiah 28:18, "Then your covenant with death will be annulled, and your agreement with Sheol will not stand. When the overwhelming scourge passes through, you will be beaten down by it." So it's in that verse too. Those are the only 3 verses in all the Old Testament where this word is translated with something other than atonement. So it seems clear that this word aptly illustrates the theology of reconciliation in the Old Testament. The life of the sacrificial animal, specifically symbolized by his blood, was required in exchange for the life of the worshiper. That's very important. I want to repeat that one time. The theology in the Old Testament was that the life of the sacrificial animal was given in exchange for the life of the guilty person. But what kind of trade is that? An animal for a human being? You think that's equivalent? Not for a number of reasons. Number one, that animal is a dumb animal. In other words, he doesn't know he's doing this. He's not a volunteer. And even if he were a volunteer, how could his life exchange for the life of a human being? There's just no comparison there. So animals don't have the nephesh that human beings have, that God has, that God gave. We are created in God's image. Animals are not, because they don't have this. God didn't give them this part. That's why we call them dumb animals. That doesn't mean that they don't know anything. You can teach animals to do wonderful tricks. Some of them are very intelligent, very smart. But they do not have what human beings have, who are created in God's image. And so there's not equivalent there. An animal's life for a human being's life, justice is being cheated, in other words. So it's not a fair trade. But this is why when Jesus Christ, God's Son, voluntarily gave his life for our life, then we can see that justice is more than compensated. Wouldn't you say so? More than compensated, because who's Jesus Christ? He's the Creator. He's God's Son. He's God. And yet he became man and gave his life in order that we may not have to die. He atoned for us. And the Hebrew Christians want to give up that sacrifice and go back to this animal sacrifice where the animal's life is given for their life? No way. They shouldn't. And if they knew what they were doing, they wouldn't do this. We're 2 minutes over. Any comment? We'll stop there with verse 5, and Lord's willing, begin with verse 6 next Sunday. Thank you for your participation.